We'll try to keep it that way. We've got a lot to talk about, and we look forward to a full discussion, especially with trustees on these topics as well as with our president. So I'd like to bring us back to order. Thank you, Lauren and Steve, again. I wasn't fully prepared for how powerful those PowerPoints were going to be. Powerful PowerPoints. Thank you. We are extremely fortunate to have with us today Mr. Russ Gould, who is chairman of the California College Futures Foundation. He's here with us today to share his thoughts and insight and expertise as we continue to focus on expanding the CSU's capacity needs. The College Futures Foundation is focused on helping assure more college graduates for a thriving California, and Russ has served previously as California's Director of Finance, Assistant State Treasurer, and as a regent of the University of California, including a stint as chair. So Russ, you feel my pain too. His complete bio is in your materials. It's an honor to have you join us today, and thank you very much for being here. Please welcome Mr. Russ Gould.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's terrific to be here. This is such a beautiful campus, and thanks for the wonderful weather. That was a thrill. I was talking to some of the folks here, and it's been great to make reacquaintances with a number of you that we've met over the years, and a lot of the new folks here. We're all in this battle for the future of higher education and what it means for the students who are working so hard to get into our four-year institutions. And so I'm going to paint a picture of some of the realities that I think we're going to face over the next couple of years, and maybe plant some seeds on how we might approach those things. I was thinking about when Adam was going through my bio, and people were going, oh, that's interesting set of things. Either that or they're thinking I can't keep a job, one or the other. But Garrett Ashley and I were talking, and he reminded me, he says, you have an unusual path on how you got here. I went to a community college, then went on to UC Berkeley to be a Russian foreign policy major, which is, I think, the prerequisite to being the chair of the UC Board of Regents. It is the only thing that will really prepare you for So let me start my comments in a very positive way, and I'm an optimist. As much as I'm going to paint some realities that we have to deal with as a society, I'm an optimistic guy. And California has many blessings. You just look at our varied countryside, our great natural resources, our diverse and committed population. It's really remarkable. California is a great experiment, and I believe we can be successful. We are now the 5th largest economy in the world, behind only the US, China, Japan, and Germany. We have to thank the UK for having a Brexit problem and dropping a little bit to give us that status, but we appreciate it. And being that I brought up Russia, our GDP is twice that of Russia. So it's a remarkable enterprise that we have a chance to try to steer and shape the future for. And you think of key things that are a factor to us, and they do influence both our politics and our resources, is the fact that we're the tech center of the world. With the Silicon Valley and emerging technology capabilities in Orange County, San Diego, Los Angeles, it stimulates California dramatically. It also creates a little bit of two Californians. You think of the coast being very affluent. And they are. They are beyond full employment. They are struggling to get additional workers. Average unemployment rate along the coast is under 3%. And you go to the Central Valley, the Inland Empire, and even Los Angeles, and you see much higher unemployment rates. So, there are some wonderful things going on in California, but some challenges that come with it. Let me reflect a little bit on something that I think was a real gift to us all. As a framing document, the master plan, which is over 50 years old, set a framework for how we should look at our public institutions providing access for a quality, affordable education for the range of skills that we need in our economy, whether people need technical education, professional education, or research. It's an opportunity provided by the master plan to do that. One thing I'll comment on, and it's a glaring omission on the master plan, there is no mention of the financing of that thought. And so as we think about it, and you will hear legislators all talk about the glories of the master plan, and I applaud them for that. But unless they put the resources behind it, it's a promise that'll be unfulfilled. So let's take a look just a little bit, and Lauren did a great job going through some of the demand, but I want to touch on it briefly just for a minute. Because when we look at the 12th graders in California, a full half of them are coming from Los Angeles, the Central Valley, and the Inland Empire. That is not the high employment centers. So we've got this mismatch between where the 12th graders are coming from and jobs. We also know that the majority of these students are Hispanic, many are low income, first time college going, and are not familiar with how to navigate the territory of higher education. And we also know, and I think Lauren's data picked up on this, that in spite of K-12 enrollment actually dropping, you're still seeing an escalation in the number of college eligibles. They're doing the right thing. They're taking the A through G courses. They're working really hard. They understand what the pathways are now to higher education. And the issue is there going to be any room at the end? So we look back as a foundation on a 10-year period from 2005 to 2015, and a full 1 million students were denied access to UC and CSU. These were applicants who said, I'd like a shot at these institutions, and they were turned away. That's a remarkable number. And we know that this mismatch between student demand and capacity is one that can't sustain California. There's been reference to the PPIC studies that shows 1.1 million new baccalaureate degrees needed by 2030. I've had these discussions with Governor Brown without a great deal of success. And I think part of the problem is that is not a well-defined enough goal. I think we need to break that down, and we need to talk about how many teachers, how many nurses, how many accountants. We need to clarify for the people of California exactly the kind of skills that are needed to sustain us. And I don't think we've done a good enough job at that. But we also know that it means a lot to get a college degree. The recent Bureau on Labor Statistics showed that the difference between a 4-year degree and someone with just high school is a 60% difference in income. California, it may be even more dramatic than that. But we know that, look, we're all in the opportunity business. That's the purpose of higher education. And for those young people who are denied that opportunity or can't access that opportunity, it's going to be a lifetime that's different for them and their families. And so I think we need to be cognizant of that. So with this self-evident pressure on the number of new students and how clear it is that there's an equity issue that needs to be addressed, it must be a pretty easy argument in Sacramento to tell legislators and the administration that with just a little bit more money, we could do a wonderful job. So I'll kind of give you a couple of perspectives. One, as being a former director of finance who got to say no to everybody, it seemed like, and as the chair of the Regents when we had the last downturn in 2008. And now we had to try to navigate that to give you a flavor of some of the things that as institutions we need to consider when we get into the tough times which are inevitable. So let's just talk about California's economy for a bit. I mentioned we're the 5th largest economy in the world, and that's terrific. But we have been on an exceptional long economic recovery. We're entering our 10th year of economic recovery. It's the second longest since World War II. And you know, economists are great. I used to work with them a great deal when I was director of finance, and it was on one hand and then the other. They looked at issues, and they never had a clear view. But they are all saying now that a recession is closer than it was a week ago. Well, thanks a lot. But it is clear that this has been a long run, and business cycles are inevitable. And we should see a downturn coming in our future. How dramatic that's going to be, we certainly don't want to see it being like 2008 and 9. That was a really rough road. But it's clear that some downturn is in our future. So let me talk a little bit about how the state budget is constructed and what the implications of higher education getting a bigger piece of the pie are. You know, it's a $140 billion general fund budget. That's pretty dramatic. It's a very sizable budget. But I would argue that while we have been on a very good roll for the last 10 years, the foundation of the state's budget has some cracks. And there are things that make us all vulnerable to what the implications of that are going to be. Let's first take a look at the tax structure for the state of California. When you look at the personal income tax has been, by vote of the people, increased fairly dramatically. We have the most progressive personal income tax structure in the nation. But 70% of our personal income, 70% of our entire budget is funded by personal income tax. 20% comes from sales tax, and 10% comes from corporate taxes. Corporate taxes have been about 10% for about the last 30 years. What's really changed is the stability of the sales tax, which used to be half the revenue source, is now gone down to 20%. So what we have is a very volatile personal income tax structure that fuels the state general fund, and it's tied to our top earners. These are the folks, and it's remarkable. I'll just share a few numbers with you. When you think of the top 1%, they pay 50% of the personal income tax in California. If you get to 0.1%, it's about 25% of the personal income tax. You've got this small sliver that's really driving what are the resources for ongoing essential programs. Now, 70% of the personal income tax is paid by 5% of the people. This is an extremely progressive structure. And I've been approached by Democratic or Republican leaders says, Russ, we need your help. We want to reshape the tax structure to make it less volatile. And I said, so how many in your caucus are ready to do a middle-class tax increase? And they said, well, none, but we just want it to be fair. And I said, well, the problem is the only way you get to stability on the personal income tax or to move to a VAT tax or any other kind of consumption tax is to actually have it be more regressive. I don't see that happening in California. So we're stuck with that kind of volatility. So what does that mean, and what does that mean for California when we do have a downturn? I'll give you a glimpse of that. In 2009, the personal income for California personal income dropped by 4%. Okay, that's a pretty dramatic change. General fund for the state of California declined by 20%. And that was before we changed the upper end brackets and increased the amount that the rich are required to pay. So I think we've got some volatility embedded within our system. So let's take a minute to look at who the other players are in the state budget, because clearly they've got too much money, and if properly redirected, it would go to higher education. So we talked about K-12, and it includes, frankly, the community colleges because of Proposition 98. It's over 40% of the state budget, but the political weight of the California Teachers Association is very strong. And they put in that initiative to protect themselves, and it's done just that. And they tend to be unyielding when it comes to making a change there. So let's take a look at health and welfare, health and human services. It's about $40 billion a year and about 30% of the budget. It's driven really by Medi-Cal. And Medi-Cal now serves 1 out of every 3 Californians. It's the biggest health insurance program in California. And so when you start talking about what's time we shave the cost in that area, you're really looking at how do we reduce health care to low-income people. Tough things to do. So let's talk about corrections, okay? And there were some charts Steve had that talked about the growth of corrections. It has stayed fairly flat over the last couple of years, but that includes a realignment proposal that shifted both resources and what were low-level prisoners down to the local level. The reality is the corrections budget, if you included all of that, is still fairly high. And it's still driven by a population that is anxious about release of prisoners back into the community if they perceive that as being too early. So those are 3 tough areas to compete against. So if you think of higher education, which is about $16 billion for the 3 segments plus the Cal Grants student aid program, it's about 12% of the budget. That's about 90% of the budget that's there. So let's look at the other 10%. There must be some areas there that we could go after. Well, that 10% includes debt service, the cost of pensions, and fire protection. So we all know how difficult those are to shave. So another way to slice and look at the budget and our relative weight and being able to go and get additional resources is that of the entire budget, 90% is directed by either state, federal law, or the Constitution. 10% is discretionary. Our 4-year institutions, CSU and UC, and student aid represent 60% of the discretionary part of the budget. So when we get in tough times, when the state gets in a pinch and says, how are we ever going to deal with this downturn, they look at higher education first. And one of the things that's interesting to think about is from the legislature standpoint, and often governors, is that higher education is the only one of those 4 big areas that has a fund source. There's no fund source for K-12. There's none for health and human services. There's none for corrections. We have tuition. And it's a progressive structure when we ask people to pay more. So that has led to a history, and I think Steve Charts pointed that out, of boom-bust for higher education. And it's miserable. Just when the economy goes south, people decide to go back to college to re-educate themselves, get additional skills, we're raising the price of admission. We're doing exactly what should be the opposite during bad times. So, but this isn't a recent problem. We've been on a 50-year downslide of the support of the public for higher education. And maybe that's why the master plan didn't mention the budget. It was at a time when there was public support, and you could see through the legislative action, and there weren't the commitments that we have to corrections, to K-12 education and others, and there didn't need to be a specific reference. But it's been declining rapidly over that time. So, you know, I was talking, there was a period of time when there were some riots in the, at UC that I was chairing the board at. And they go in to talk to the director of finance, who was Ana Santos, and they were arm in arm. It was the students and labor saying, you know, what's going on at UC is totally unacceptable. We need to change this. And the student says, we're totally supportive of labor. There should be no furloughs, there's salary reductions, there's change in pension. You know, we're committed to them. And labor said, we're absolutely committed to no tuition on the part of students. And, you know, and the director of finance called me and says, I can only hope none of them are econ majors, you know. So now let me give credit to Governor Brown. I think he has done something that is very good. It's good for California, and that's he's built a reserve. there's a $16 billion reserve. And I think he's to be commended for that. That's a very good thing. Now, the suitors for that reserve in a downturn are going to be all the people I just mentioned. And the Department of Finance, in order to kind of promote the idea of this reserve, said, our analysis shows that in the next just kind of middle-of-the-road recession, it will cost the state of California $55 billion in revenues over 3 years. So as much as the governor has put a buffer to help with a downturn, it's going to be swamped by the next recession, and I think everyone understands that. So there are some challenges ahead as we look at the financial picture. I thought I'd reflect a little bit on when I was chair of UC during the last major recession in 2008, 2009. Some of the people in the room were partners with me in that effort, and I'm sure there were some of you at CSU who were part of engineering your way out of it. But just a glimpse of what it means like to be in that kind of downturn and the decisions required to navigate through that. Well, we started off by the governor, who had a compact with us for stable funding, reduced our budget by 30% and said, Russ, I have no choice. I know you'll figure out a way. Well, you know, with that pat on the back, we proceeded to raise tuition by 32% in 1 year. That covered less than half of the loss of the general fund because we put a third of any tuition back into financial aid. And so our total impact, when you cut a budget by 30%, we maybe got 10% of that back by raising tuition. But at the same time, we diverted monies to establish a Blue and Gold scholarship program. And that was for any family under $80,000. We basically made sure there was no tuition impact. They were not going to pay tuition. We actually put in later support up to $120,000 in income to support families. It was hard to get that story out. It was so easy for people to write stories about poor families who were dropping out of UC because of the tuition increase. And we just wanted to get a hold of the reporters and strangle them. And say, just think of the unintended consequences. You know, the other young people who are reading that article, they're going to say, well, that's just like my family. There's no room for me either. And it's a shame. Now, my understanding is that CSU also does a great job in supporting low-income students, and I think that's terrific. I think that's got to be the measure of how we do things in the future. But other things we did is we dramatically increased the number of out-of-state students at UC. And we said, without sounding like a mercenary, we needed the additional resources. And we opened up the doors to people from out of state. It actually allowed us to keep our state numbers, the number of state students, fairly flat. And that was a good thing to do. We wanted to maintain access for California students. But it took, frankly, bringing in those out-of-state students to make it work. We did do furloughs. We furloughed everyone. I don't think ever in the history of the University of California, faculty, staff, food service workers, everybody took a furlough. We did salary cuts. We eliminated over 4,000 positions. We eliminated another 10,000 positions. These were positions on the books that people had been promised. These are growth areas. We just got rid of them. We said there's no illusion those are coming back. And we also pursued administrative efficiencies. And Peter Taylor was one of the engineers of making a lot of that work. But we got into purchasing cooperatives. So computers that could be purchased openly on the market before all had to go through central purchasing. I know you're involved in the same kind of efforts. We did debt restructuring. We did pension reform. We did retiree health modifications. Everywhere we could, we looked at changing that. And like CSU, at UC, it's about 80% of your budget is personnel costs. It's either salaries, pensions, health care. And so it's a target that we had to go after. And one of the things we did rather quietly, but it's had an impact, is we've increased the student-faculty ratio by about 20%. We don't advertise that as a grand success, but it's a reality of what we had to do. And we like to think we've maintained our quality. We've added online classes. We've increased class size. We've done a number of things, but it's a change that we wouldn't have tried to go at directly. It just became a factor that each campus said, how can I deal with the cuts that are coming here, and how can I still sustain quality on the campus? So it's what happened. But each response you have in these areas, every great idea, whether it's debt restructuring or changes in pension, it limits your ability the next time you face a crisis. Because the first idea is always the easiest one. The next idea you have on pension reform or health care reduction is going to be that much tougher. So we all know we've captured, and I'm not saying any of it's easy, but we've captured some of the A ideas. We'll be moving to the C and B ideas over time, and that's just reality. So I guess my comments today, I want to leave you with those two kind of converging major issues. One is this growing number, primarily Hispanic, low-income students in a society that needs more teachers, nurses, accountants, researchers, and scientists to maintain our place in the world and our growing economy. At the same time, we have the inevitability of a business cycle that's going to change the revenue structure for the state of California and our ability to cope with it. And so the question is, how can we keep the door open and maintain access to quality education for that cadre of young people? Now, the foundation that I chair is immersed in this question also. And we're trying to find a way out to advise the next governor, to the legislature, and to education leaders. A couple of areas we're looking at that we think need to be started very soon to buffer against the next recession and the challenge we face on access. And one is what we're calling a tuition stabilization account, that we create a reserve for higher education that really buffers the institution and buffers from these kind of tremendous boom-bust cycles and exaggerated tuition increases that we've been subject to over the last couple of decades. With that tuition stabilization account would be a multi-year agreement, and that multi-year agreement requires the state to commit its resources in a gradual but predictable way, and at the same time, the institutions would look at tuition growing in a gradual, predictable way so that families and students can understand what the implications of their college degree is going to be. With that kind of multi-year plan, we believe there have got to be institutional efficiencies that are implemented also. That in order to convince the taxpayers and the legislature that resources need to be set aside for higher education, that efficiencies in your operations have to be shown. And that can include time to degree, it can include changes in some of your labor costs, but you've got to be able to illustrate that you're shaving your costs. It's not just all more money from the state, that we're doing our part to bring our institutions into line in terms of its financial situation. The final piece that we're looking at, and Tim, I think, referred to this earlier, is to rebuild our physical capacity. You know, when we've got these wave of new students, we've got to think collectively about how to use the resources, our physical resources, in a way that can serve more students. I think that means better collaboration between all systems, the community colleges in particular, but between CSU and UC. It means updating our aging classrooms, labs, and student housing so that what are now often obsolete for the kind of instructional techniques of today are more responsive to those needs. We think that kind of requirement to look among the systems and to see how we can partner together to be using our facilities and updating them is critical. And it's been clear why it hasn't been done. In tough times in the budget, it's very difficult to set aside the resources for some of the deferred maintenances and other improvements that we'd like to make. So as a foundation, we are researching these areas. We're working with leaders in higher education, and hopefully we'll come up with some ideas that will shape the agenda of the next governor and provide a future for higher education in California. So thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.